Games are goal-oriented, they're rule-based, and players find their fun working towards a goal, right? Well, maybe not. Over the last decade, we've seen the emergence of many things called quote-unquote games that don't have goals, or at the very least, the goals are optional. So join me, Ryan Wienko, as we explore a world of games without goals. This is Industry Broadcast. Before beginning today's piece, I would just like to thank JesperJuul, PhD, for writing it, and remind everybody that his blog can be found at JesperJuul, that's JesperJuul.net. Goals in games. According to widespread theory, video games are goal-oriented. They're rule-based activities where players find enjoyment in working towards the game goal. According to this theory, game goals provide a sense of direction and a sense of setting up a challenge that the player must face. However, the last decade has seen many things described as games that either do not have goals or have goals that are optional for the player. Sims 2, Max's 2004, has no stated goals, but is nevertheless extremely popular. The also popular Grand Theft Auto San Andreas Rockstar North 2005 is superficially a goal-oriented game, yet the game allows the player to perform a wide range of actions while ignoring the game goal. San Andreas is in many ways as different from The Sims 2 as can be possible. Whereas The Sims 2 has no goal, San Andreas contains an explicit goal. Where San Andreas is infamous for being known as immoral and violent, The Sims 2 is famous for its family-oriented friendliness. Yet, San Andreas and Sims 2 are fundamentally similar in that they are top-selling, open, and expressive games. Games that let the player use them for many different ways. Games that allow the many different playing styles and for players to pursue personal agendas. These two games demonstrate that removing or making optional the goals of a game can make way for new types of player experiences. These goals, while providing a sense of direction and challenge in games, can also limit the player. A goal means that the player should work towards the goal rather than follow his or her own personal inclinations. Based on an examination of Sims 2, San Andreas, and the arcade game Scramble, Konami 1981, I will argue that popular games without enforced goals generally have large expressive potential and provide a wide range of possible experiences. The Sims 2 player can create any kind of family and decorate the house. The San Andreas player can ignore the goal for a while and focus on practicing bicycle stunts or exploring the countryside. Removing or weakening the goals of the game affords a wider range of player experiences, where competitive multiplayer games or traditional action games force players to focus on optimizing their performance in relation to the goal. These games let players make decisions based on other criteria. The Sims 2 player buys not the optimal chair, but a beautiful chair. A complete theory of video games. There is a popular theory that could be called the complete theory of video games. It is a theory that describes the complete connections between the game's artifact, the gameplay of the game, and the experience of the players, while allowing for variations between individual player tastes and skills. This is the theory. Games have goals. Goals provide challenges to the players. It is the mental challenge of a game that provides the fun. If the challenge is right, the player is in a state of flow. If the challenge is too easy, the player is bored. If the challenge is too hard, the player is frustrated. It is a theory that has been presented in many guises. In its most concise form, Sid Meier, designer of Civilization and other classics, has said that a game is a series of interesting choices. That is, that a game's quality hinges on it presenting interesting mental choices and challenges to the player. In a more elaborate version, Ralph Koster's book, A Theory of Fun, focuses on humans as pattern matchers that seek to find the pattern in any game, and find the game boring once the pattern has been found. The theory's focus on challenges is supported by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's work on flow in 1990. Flow is a highly positive mental state that people reach when they are met with a situation with a challenging activity that requires skills and clear goals and feedback. People in a state of flow often report a loss of self-consciousness and an altered sense of the passing of time. Csikszentmihalyi describes a flow channel, which is the balance between a challenge being too easy leads to boredom and being too hard leads to anxiety. When a challenge corresponds to a person's skill level, the person will enter a state of flow. This theory entails the important assertion that the primary interest for players is in mastering the game's rules, but that the fiction of the game is of lesser importance. The sociologist Irving Goffman has described this as the rules of irrelevance. To quote, "Games illustrate how participants are willing to forswear, for the duration of the play, any apparent interest in the aesthetic, sentimental, or monetary value of the equipment employed, adhering to what might be called the rules of irrelevance. For example, it appears that whether checkers are played with bottle caps on the piece of squared linoleum, or with gold figurines in inlaid marble, or with uniformed men standing on colored flagstones in a specifically arranged court square, the pairs of players can start with the same positions, employ the same sequence of strategic moves and counter moves, and generate the same contour of excitement. As such, this complete theory of games describes the connection between the formal properties of a game, rules and goals, the subjective player experience, the player's use of a game over time, and the variation between different players. The theory also explains why goals are so important, since goals set up the challenge of a game. Without a goal, there is no well-defined challenge. The theory indirectly points to the limits of the traditional goal-oriented game. Clear goals also mean clear failure, which may not suit a specific player, since different players have different levels of frustration tolerance. Goals may also run counter to what the players want to do. Players may care more about the aesthetic or sentimental value of game choices than about the optimal way of playing the game. Games with goals afford certain types of experiences as well, and leave less room for others. So, what makes a goal? To say that a specific game has a goal is to say that it is an activity which contains an imperative. In a game, some of the possible outcomes are assigned positive values, and players should work towards these positive outcomes. This means that a commercial game has to communicate its goal in some way. It also means that soccer pitches or soccer balls do not have goals, as they are not activities. The game of soccer has a goal. We use the term soccer to denote a specific activity with goals. That Sims 2 does not have a goal means there is no clear value that has been assigned to the different events and outcomes of the game. Sims 2 can be played with specific goals in mind, but Sims 2 refers to a game without goals. Sims 2 is like a soccer ball that can be used for a variety of goal-oriented and goal-less activities. At the same time, games differ in the extent to which they force the player into pursuing the goal. In many multiplayer games, there is a strong social pressure towards pursuing the goal, as teammates or opponents may refuse to play with a player that does not pursue the goal, a spoil sport. In single-player games, the issue is more to what extent it is possible to pursue personal goals rather than the official goal. Additionally, a goal does not mean that the game can be completed. A goal can be to achieve a high score. This is the standard type of goal in arcade games, for example in the arcade game Scramble. Scramble. Obligatory goals. Scramble is representative of the way goals were constructed and communicated in the early arcade games. The Scramble cabinet states the following. Object of the game is to invade 5 Scramble defense systems to destroy the base. Use joystick to move up, down, accelerate, and decelerate. Use laser and bombs to destroy rockets, fuel tanks, mystery targets, and UFOs. Hit fuel tanks for extra fuel for aircraft. Bonus aircraft at 10,000 points. The goal of Scramble is also indicated by the way of taunting text on the main screen. How far can you invade our Scramble systems? As such, the explicitly stated goal of the game to get as far as possible is unambiguous, but there is a second implicit goal, to get a high score. The question here is to what extent it is possible to ignore the goal of the game when playing. As a first experiment, we can try invading the Scramble system not as far but as short as possible. This is in actuality very easy, but not terribly satisfying. The game allows us to simply drive the aircraft into the ground immediately 3 times, yielding a total score of 110 points. Since Scramble scrolls the screen right to left at a steady pace, the player has no option but to invade the Scramble system, otherwise the game will end. As an alternative strategy, we can see whether Scramble accommodates as subversive pacifist playing styles where the player does not attack anything. This is prevented by the basic mechanic of Scramble, in that the player runs out of fuel and must replenish by attacking the fuel tanks stationed at the bottom of the screen. Failing to do so renders the aircraft uncontrollable and leads to a crash. In any prolonged playing of Scramble, the player is forced to work towards the goal, and in some extent also forced to use specific playing styles. These are characteristic traits of traditional arcade games, where the goal has a number of recognizable features. Goals are explicitly communicated. There are dual goals between progressing in the game and getting a high score. The game strongly punishes the player that tries not to reach the goal, ending the game, and the range of playing styles offered by the game is relatively narrow. With clear goals, clear challenges, and clear feedback, the traditional arcade game fits the complete theory of video games very well. San Andreas. Optional goals. The Grand Theft Auto series of games nominally shares an emphasis on goals with the arcade game, but is in actual play a very different experience. The back cover of Grand Theft Auto San Andreas states, "Now it's the early 1990s. Carl's got to go home. His mother's been murdered, his family's fallen apart, and his childhood friends are all heading towards disaster. On his return to the neighborhood, a couple of corrupt cops frame him for homicide. CJ is forced on a journey that takes him across the entire state of San Andreas to save his family and take control of the streets." The text sets up a goal not entirely unlike that of Scramble. The player should not invade the Scramble system, but save Carl's family and take control of the streets. The game begins with a cutscene showing Carl returning to San Andreas and being met by unfriendly police. Once the interactive part of the game begins, the player is instructed to get on a bike and follow the radar to return to Carl's old neighborhood. This leads to the player meeting old friends and family and beginning a series of missions. The stated goal of saving Carl's family and cleaning up the streets is achieved by completing the long series of missions that the game presents. Again, this is quite similar to the model of Scramble. What is not similar is the fact that the game does not force the player into pursuing the stated goal. Right from the beginning of the game, rather than following the radar to CJ's old neighborhood, the player can choose to bicycle around town, improving our cycling skill, practicing more stunts, even earning money doing this. This makes San Andreas another type of game, one where the player is free to deviate from the official goal of the game and to make up personal goals, improving cycling skills, for example, modify the looks of their character, or simply explore the game world. San Andreas is a game with goals, but the goals are optional. Sims 2, Without a Goal. The back cover of Sims 2 states, "The next generation people simulator. They're born, they die. What happens in between is up to you. In this sequel to the best-selling PC game of all time, we now take your Sims from cradle to grave through life's greatest moments. Create your Sims, push them to extremes, realize their fears, fulfill their life dreams." The game is presented as having no specific goal, but rather allowing the player something akin to complete freedom. What happens in between is up to you. In actuality, the game consists of choosing a town, creating a family, or using predefined families, building them a house, trying to deal with their wants and desires, while trying to make them do what you want them to do. The Sims 2 does not yield a full control over its characters. Rather, characters may refuse to do what the players ask them to. Couples may dislike each other, and so on. The Sims 2 pulls in several different directions. The game has no imperative, no demands on what the player should do, yet Sims, the characters in the game, generally become miserable if the player does nothing. The game is very open, but it also sets up a path of least resistance where purchasing more items for the Sims and trying to make their personalities match leads them to becoming happier, which in turn makes it easier to make money for them. Yet a large part of the home decoration is not as much functional as it is aesthetic. Sims enjoy having chairs and tables, but players could choose between a wide range of chairs and tables, many of which will be functionally identical. Sims 2 allows for precisely the type of consideration that Goffman denied in the quote above. The players can play based on aesthetic considerations. Players do not have to choose an optimal chair, but they can choose a beautiful chair. Still, the financial and character personality constraints in the game means that as a player, you cannot do what the packaging promises, because much of what happens is not up to you. Sims 2 is not a dollhouse. During my playing of the game, I instructed a character called Cornwall to eat snacks and lunch 7 times in a row. I intended Cornwall to eat all of the food, but in actuality, a fire broke out in the kitchen, which led to a nervous breakdown of Cornwall, who was then visited by a doctor. This is my intention. I wish for Cornwall to eat all of the food I'd instructed him to eat, yet this is not what actually happens. The events in Sims 2 are not simply up to the player, but result from the interaction between the player and the objects in the game, the whims of the characters' internal moods, and the financial constraints in the game. As such, Sims 2 is a mirror image of San Andreas. Sims 2 promises absolute freedom, but is a game with many constraints and resistances to the player's plans. San Andreas promises a clear goal, but provides much freedom and allows the player to ignore the goal entirely. Sims 2 does have a general nudging of a player in certain directions. Improving character happiness requires improving their material conditions, and as such the player is not free to play in any way he or she likes. A beautiful chair, expressive games. As outlined, the potential problem with goals is that they may force players into optimizing their strategy rather than doing something else that they'd rather be doing. The last few decades has seen much experimentation with goals. There is a whole class of goalless games, such as Sims 2, SimCity, and many role-playing games. Additionally, many games with goals put no strong pressure on the player to pursue this goal. Prior to Grand Theft Auto 3 in 2001, games such as Elite, Firebird Software 1985, Pirates, Microprose Software 1987, and Super Mario 64, Nintendo 1996, were among the most prominent games with non-enforced goals. Games without goals, or optional goals, can accommodate more playing styles and player types, in effect letting players choose what kind of games they want to play. Not having enforced goals also changes the rules of irrelevance, mentioned in the Goffman quote earlier. When the player is not under strong pressure to optimize the strategy, the player is afforded room to play with other purposes, such as designing a house that the player finds aesthetically pleasing. If we assume that the complete theory of video games provides a reasonable explanation of game enjoyment, these new games pose a problem. If goals provide a challenge that players enjoy working towards, why would anybody want to play a game without a goal? One way to see this is to consider games as vehicles of expression. There is much indication that many players find great enjoyment in creating and showing off families and houses in Sims, and exploring and perfecting their clever maneuvers in Grand Theft Auto 3. To see games as expressive devices, they can be considered as languages. A language can be said to contain a lexicon, the words, and a syntax, the arrangement of words. In this perspective, an expressive game is one that allows the players to arrange and combine the elements in a game in a large number of different ways in a way that players interpret to have a wide range of meanings. The game requires an amount of flexibility and openness in order to let the players express themselves through the game. Scramble is not an expressive game because the range of potential events, the lexicon, is very small, and because the game forces the player into playing for a goal, a very rigid syntax. San Andreas and Sims 2 feature a wide range of objects and events, the lexicon, while accommodating a wide range of playing styles, the syntax. As such, they are very flexible systems for producing meaning. The expressivity of Sims 2 and San Andreas also comes from the fact that these games express events that are conventionally meaningful: social interactions, life and death in Sims 2, violence, exploration, social status, and skilled performances in San Andreas. As a comparison, Conway's Game of Life is not a game, but a system that generates developing patterns based on a very few simple rules. An online version of Conway's Game of Life can be seen at half-real.net/gameoflife. Conway's Game of Life technically has a very rich number of combinations, syntax, that can only produce cells that are either on or off, a small lexicon. It has a wide number of possible configurations and patterns, but has very little expressive potential because it does not look like anything. There is no conventional way of interpreting specific configurations. The language analogy also illustrates why San Andreas and Sims 2 are not languages. While the games as they appear are the combination of large numbers of objects, the player, unlike the speaker of a language, cannot simply combine objects arbitrarily. These games offer a resistance to what the player may try to do. Sims 2 is not a dollhouse, as users of a dollhouse may, more or less convincingly, craft whatever events they want to. But the user of Sims 2 has only partial control, and can only modify the house with sufficient in-game money, and can only try to push the characters to do what the player wants them to do. The characters may refuse to abide with the player's wishes. The San Andreas player cannot simply fly a car through the air between two buildings, but must rely on the available game physics, resources, and personal skills. This is the limit of the language analogy, and it raises a new question. Why would players not simply prefer a game where they could set up any type of events that they wanted, actually tell a story as they wish? A first straightforward answer is that the resistance offered by these games is also a challenge as stipulated in the complete theory of video games. A second answer is that though the player may not be able to make the game produce the events that he or she wants, such failure is in itself an interesting event. That is, the lack of complete control over the game's events is offset by the interest that lies in trying, and sometimes failing to control the game. Trying and failing to bring two characters in The Sims together is in itself an interesting event that is also worth retelling, because the failure to execute a plan is interesting in itself. The story I told you about trying to make my character eat food with a fire ensuing is much more interesting than had my character simply performed my wishes. Yet the challenge that makes it hard to use these games as tools for expression, as languages, can be mitigated by the use of cheat codes. Cheat codes are not illegitimate hacks, but semi-official game features created by the game developers and purposefully leaked into the game-playing community. In The Sims 2, typing motherlode gives the player 50,000 credits to spend. Cheat codes are designed to let the players circumvent the challenges of the game, and rather set up a game world in the way that the player likes. As such, cheat codes can be a way of making games more like languages, where players can combine the elements of the game in any way they want. Cheat codes make games less challenging and more expressive. Problems in the payoff. Clear goals place the player in well-defined positions, where the player is at least supposed to optimize his or her strategy in order to work towards the goal of the game. One way to analyze such situations is by the way of the field of economic game theory. Economic game theory is not the study of games as much as the study of how to optimally solve certain well-defined problems. For any classic goal-oriented game, we can in principle perform a game theoretical analysis of how to play the game, including what strategies are optimal and what strategies to avoid. However, such an analysis requires that the game has only one measurement of payoff. In game terms, such an analysis assumes that there is a goal, or more specifically, that there is a valorization of the outcome, that some outcomes are officially sanctioned in the game as better than others. The goal of a game provides a measuring of all things in the game. In a game with no goal, there is no standard measure of the payoffs. We cannot make a general analysis of optimal strategies for which chair to buy in Sims 2, as there is no fixed scale to measure the strategies against. The strategic analysis can only be made for a specific personal goal, such as maximize Sim's happiness with given resources, or create a cool-looking house, but not for the game as such. We find the same situation in many role-playing games and in online games such as the World of Warcraft, where the game may have a semi-official goal of gaining a higher level in the game, but where actual playing can be a mix of social interactions, exploration, strategic plannings, and aesthetic preferences on character creation. In such multiplayer games, we can in principle perform a strategic analysis for various situations such as battling monsters, but in actual play, many other considerations can intervene. In a non-electronic example, researcher Linda Hughes has studied children playing the game Foursquare. Foursquare can be described as a volleyball-tennis variation played with a ball on 4 squares chalked on the ground. Players have to hit the ball so that it lands in the square of another player. Failing to return the ball to another square forces the player to leave the game and queue up for when another player fails and a square becomes available again. Hughes observed the children playing with a number of considerations, such as helping friends rather than trying to improve their performance. She concludes, game rules can be interpreted and reinterpreted towards preferred meaning and purposes, selectively invoked or ignored, challenged or defended, changed or enforced to suit the collective goals of different groups of players. In short, players can take the same game and collectively make it strikingly different in experiences. I think this broad claim needs to be supplemented with an analysis of Foursquare. Foursquare is a game without any final outcome, which means that though players may aim at performing well according to the goal of staying in the game, the lack of scorekeeping allows the players to help friends rather than try to maximize their performance. It also means that every possible action can be evaluated by several, sometimes conflicting criteria: staying in the game, or being helpful to a friend, or displaying mastery. What evaluation criteria are present depends on the game and on the context. A version of Foursquare played with scorekeeping and cash prizes would likely see very different behavior from the players. Conclusions. In this essay, I have sketched the limited but seemingly complete theory of video games with goals, and I have pointed out how games without goals, or with optional goals, can work in a different way, allowing players to play according to personal, aesthetic, and social considerations. This does not render the complete theory irrelevant. It simply means that the theory has limits. Multiplayer games tend to have an uneasy relation between what is inside the game and what is outside the game. The goal of a game can be considered a social norm for how the player should behave, and the magic circle that delineates the game has the connotation that players should not bring personal feelings into the game, and should not bring what happened in the game to bear on non-game events. The archetypical situation where this is not observed are the cases of a sore loser, and of the adult that plays badly in order not to win against a child. A sore loser fails to leave the game properly, and the adult playing badly downplays inter-game goal optimization in favor of an extra-game social consideration. The Foursquare example illustrates a specific way of framing a game session where repetition mitigates the impact of the goal. Playing the same card game or action game many times over without keeping an overall score changes the game playing in a direction where maximizing personal performance becomes less of a necessity. In this way, a goal-oriented game can be played as a game without a goal by replaying it numerous times. Outside games, there are a number of rule-based activities that do not work very well without goals. Rubik's Cube is only interesting when trying to complete it, since it has little expressive potential. Conway's Game of Life is remarkably like Sims 2 in its tension between the player having control and not having control, but Conway's Game of Life certainly lacks the broad appeal of Sims 2. As a commercial product, it is hard to imagine a goal-less abstract game. On the other hand, a number of other rule-based activities are interesting without goals. Musical instruments, Lego, Tangram, playing sequences of games with goals without keeping score, These activities are popular because they allow for a wide range of discernibly different expressions to be made. Games without enforced goals will not replace the classic goal-oriented game, but they open for a wide range of new player experiences as seen in the two quite similar games Sims 2 and Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. This is the new style in video games, and an illustration of how contemporary video games are severing the ties to their historical roots in the arcade game, becoming somewhat new and unique, open, and expressive. And this wraps it up for another great piece from JesperJuul, PhD, whose blog can be found at JesperJuul.net. My name is Ryan Wienko, and I'll keep on bringing the collective insight of the gaming industry to your ears as long as you keep on heading over to industrybroadcast.com.